Batu, Barada, Nikto. You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing? You okay?
I'm doing just fine. My flying saucer landed on time for the podcast, so I'm filled with vim and vigor. How are you feeling?
Oh, not too bad. I think it's good to know that intergalactic travel is running on time. At least we can do one thing. We can keep the flying saucers running on time.
Oh, you're not. You humans aren't doing it.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear on that. You guys can't get trains to go properly.
No, this is true. Yes. Yeah, we're never going to achieve interstellar travel, really, are we? Anyway, what we're going to be doing in this episode, there's no film this episode. We're going to be talking about a bunch of films. We are going to be doing a sort of a mini interlude on our usual journey through the years. We're going to go back and we're going to do a review and a sort of backwards discussion on all of the films that we covered in our 50s block. We've talked about several films within our 50s sci-fi canon. I'll give a rundown. We talked about When Worlds Collide from 1951. It Came from Outer Space, 1953. Them from 1954. The Quatermass Experiment, 1955. Earth versus the Flying Saucers, 1956. The Quatermass 2, 1957, and The Tingler, 1959. So a good spread throughout the decade, and some British and some American sci-fi, and also from a whole bunch of genres. I think we covered a real gamut of the decade, really. And so I think we should start with, as a general term, really. Did you enjoy doing these 50s films?
You know, I did, and then when I'm looking back on my ratings, I think they're lower than past seasons. You know, I don't know how many of these are good films, but I'm glad to have watched them, and I definitely enjoy. You know, the thing about sci-fi is I always enjoy. You know, I'm incapable of not enjoying finding something good about every sci-fi film. But I legitimately enjoyed several of these. You know, if not all of them on some level. What about you?
No, similar. I think the it's an experience I'm glad we've done. It's one of those things that sort of, it's a decade that we don't really touch on. I think there's a lot of films from sort of like the 60s, starting with sort of 2001 and moving forward, that sort of a lot of people know and talk about, and then well into the 70s and 80s. So it's sort of like, it's almost like a break in 1960 when these, when people's film knowledge really starts. So the 50s never gets talked about. So I didn't know much about a lot of these films. Like, I was aware of some of them, and probably more so than some of the others. But to do them all, it was really interesting to me. Sort of from just almost like a filmmaking standpoint as well. Just like watching how some of these were made was quite interesting. And like you, though, sort of, I don't think my ratings are as high as if anything, my ratings aren't as high as I thought they would be when I sort of came back to think about them. But I definitely enjoyed them. I really did. I think the question is, will I come back to any of them? There's a couple I probably will do, and you probably have to guess which ones. But I think it's an interesting bunch of films.
The other thing is that a lot of them are memorable for things other than what we typically like in films, right? Like, I don't know that any of these. I mean, like, Quatermass is a kind of memorable character. I don't know that I could tell you, outside of that, and his name is in the title, any of the characters' names. But like, I mean, The Tingler's known for its sort of metafictional aspects. you have the sort of like Earth versus the Flying Saucers, Ray Harryhausen stuff, the giant ants. I mean, they're fun and they're known for things that are different than the usual considerations of a character who we really love or believe in, or communicating something especially deep. All of those things are sort of a little light here.
Would you describe them as disposable?
No, I think that's
and
going too far.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they were meant to be in most cases, But I also think that even most good art was meant to be disposable in the sense that it was meant to, have a theatrical run and not last. It certainly wasn't meant to be talked about 70 years later.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I think there's some of these did feel weirdly of them. They sort of fun. I think Earth versus the Flying Saucers is the one that sort of jumps to mind. It was fun, and like I said, the Ray Harryhausen modeling and stuff is really cool. But it felt like the most disposable of all of them. And I think we sort of said that in the show. It's very much like it's good fun. It's almost like blockbuster cinema, that blockbuster model at the time. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to show you this and you're going to see the spectacle. But there's very little thematic behind it. Like, it doesn't really want to make a comment on anything. It's just look, we got flying saucers and they look pretty cool. So that was the one that sort of came to me. The others, I think, sort of weirdly, as you say, are designed to be probably shown once, and they may turn up again in double features and that sort of thing. But they're definitely not now. This is a different filmmaking era than now, when you can watch like a Transformers film and Michael Bay be like, well, what we're actually dealing with is, there's none of that. There's not a sort of like, oh, I was trying to think about the sort of like, what is it true to the human essence when I was making this werewolf movie, or this other film. It's like, no, we're trying to make a film that's about giant ants and
right. Yeah, and I mean, Them is the other example like that for me. Yeah, I know what you're saying. Like, it's sort of expected now that even it's like Fast and the Furious is about family. Come on,
Yeah, well, they did. I mean, even now, we there's been films. I think Snyder, and I'm not going to be a Snyder basher. Well, at least not for long. But even like with Army of the Dead that you made recently with Netflix, like they did a making of, and there's bits in that, and they're like, oh yeah, well, what we're trying to show is this, and we're trying to portray this about the human condition. I'm like, it's a zombie film set in Vegas. It's and you've got like you don't have to try and present everything. And I think like these are the good entertainment. These were really good entertainment, and I kind of like that element as well, if I'm honest.
Yeah, and I have certainly as a writer, I have that feeling of like this. Every story should be about other things, or should be grounded in at least thematic points, right? Having said that, I really hate it when people do that, and you sort of like call bullshit on the Comic-Con interview kind of thing, where it's like, yeah, Superman punching something, is not a metaphor for teenage suicide. Okay,
Yeah. And I don't think that that was an intent of the 50s. We haven't gone back any further. If anything, I still feel that, like, I don't know if you go back to the 30s, or I've watched 30s films. I mean, I've watched a lot of the classic sort of the Hammer horror, so the Universal monster movies and all that kind of thing. A lot of others. I don't think that was there then, but there was still a definite. Well, saying that, I don't know.
No, I think they do a better job. I mean, in fact, if there's one other sort of like decade block that, more than any other that I'd love to do is pre-50 stuff. And, obviously, like, Metropolis, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. But there's also, a lot else that's sort of been, forgotten and isn't seen as much. But when you think about like even Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, I mean they definitely depict a sort of sense of like the
Oh,
persecuted outsider. I mean,
yes.
and mob mentality. I mean, there's deeper stuff going on there. That's not true of all of the monster. I mean, King Kong is just King Kong, right?
Yeah.
I mean, uh it's not a metaphor for anything. It's a big ape, you know. I mean,
Well, people
there's that love
people
thing
have
at the end.
tried. Every film, people will try and give it, um, and I won't go into King Kong. That's a different show, maybe one day. But yeah, you're right, and you actually probably right. But why is that? I mean, we didn't choose these films
Hmm.
on any premise. There was no sort of like, oh, I want to do this because they are. We chose them because we know the films, or we wanted to watch them. And what is it then in 50s cinema that sort of, I don't want to say devoid of thematics or anything, because I think some of them did have some a little bit. I mean, When Worlds Collide has definitely got sort of like some things in there we're able to talk about. The idea of they push for a future generation, which feels very appropriate for a post-war America. In Quatermass 2, we talked about well, it's also in the idea of bureaucracy and unionization and stuff like that. Like you can see some of it in there, but it's tough to pull out. Like I don't think it's there as sort of like intended subtext in many cases. But what is it then about 50s cinema that that took that away?
Well, I mean, my theory is what was going on both in America and in Hollywood at the time, that censorship is much stronger, in this period. There's you're into the Red Scare basically by the time the 50s start. That stuff really started in the late 40s. And so there's a lot of censorship and self-censorship, and those sort of expectations that a film should have something to say, that I think you see in the ambitious films of earlier, sort of just goes away. I think the deepest we get this season is It Came from Outer Space, with a sort of idea of like they're not violent aliens, right?
Yeah.
And mankind's inability to trust, right? Like I don't know if there's a danger there. Probably nuke it,
Yeah.
And that gets into some deeper stuff, but it's more grace notes, right?
Yeah.
Than you would expect in other stuff. So I don't know. That's my theory.
No, I agree. And I was thinking the same in this thing of like say, because what you in the early 50s you do get like McCarthyism and the Red Scare's there. So, and especially in Hollywood at this period, sort of from the 40s, like straight. Well, it happened well post war, straight on. There was this fear of being blackballed, wasn't there? So, if you could be pointed out for specific things that were rampant in the 30s and before the war, like well, this producer or this director was clearly a homosexual, and you go, well, yeah, but they were. You knew that 10 years ago, so what's the problem now? But like,
Right.
but then there's things like, well, this film they've written has a communist or can be seen as having a commie theme, then that's it, your career's over. So I can imagine that there was this thing of like reading through scripts and going, yep, no, that's fine. There's nothing here that can be read into it. I've tried to keep it devoid of message. It's just entertainment, possibly for in this sort of for like you said, for fear of being persecuted or outed or sort of like if impacting their career. I mean, we've looked at sci-fi films, and I don't want to go too far afield, but like. I do wonder if that was applicable to other cinema types. I mean, westerns were still the big thing in the 50s. Was it still applicable? Could you see that same thing there, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I don't think it's as extreme as this batch, and there are sci-fi films from the 50s that I think are deeper than this. We have looked at. We looked at Forbidden Planet, right?
Sure.
I mean, that's 56. Yeah. I think it's not super deep, but that's, it's made on a different level. The Day the Earth Stood Still is one of my favorites from 51. And that's clearly a deep, movie. But I think the 50s were also, for as much as it's sort of like the nostalgic decade for Americans, especially baby boomers, it was a really superficial decade. I mean, it's like, yeah, okay, I'm not immune from the charm of a malt at the ice cream shop,
Yeah.
and all of that, and drive-in theaters, and the the sort of drive-in burger places kind of thing. But and there's an aesthetic there, but yeah, I mean, all of that stuff is really sort of superficial. It's not like, when you look back on like the 90s, you think of like, Nirvana and, stuff that was about something, or the 60s, it was about, Woodstock and, peace and love and issues like that, and the war. The 50s are just sort of like, don't rock the boat. We like our creature comforts,
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is, I think the thing from it, it's still a post-war. You've had 5 years, and I think we've got to accept as well in this modern time that things move faster nowadays. And not to sort of downplay any tragedies or any wars that have happened, but like we don't talk about off air. You were talking about things, and we've got a 5-minute memory these days. Like major things happen, and we're like, yeah, it's a real tragedy, and we'll probably remember it on this day every year. But the impact, I mean, there have been events, 9/11 being obviously the major one. But like this was like, the World War II had a global impact, and a lot of these films are made in the shadow of that, where there are people that are starring in these films that were probably fought in the war, at least in some of the earlier ones. But also this idea of, like I say, this is a boom, or at least they're trying to make it a boom decade, where they're like, yeah, it was awful. That thing in the 40s was horrible and dreadful, and we lost millions of people globally, and we've ended up in this sort of like global sort of Cold War with this other superpower. So we just want to focus on us. We want to keep everything, like you say, hunky dory. Don't rock the boat. Let's just keep it sweet. And I suppose that's sort of what it is, isn't it? It's that thing of sort of like almost like protectionist psychologically, to an extent, of like, yeah, we don't want to do anything too big, like we've got to keep it stable, which I sort of understand, but it makes it very bland in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way of looking at it is sort of like the peace dividend, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, we've been through that. The 50s were, I mean, maybe the best thing you could say about that American nostalgia is that it was our time,
Yeah.
I mean, America was, despite fears of the missile gap and the bomber gap, I mean, America was on top of the world. And so that's one reason why nationalists look back to it. But then the flip side of that is, yeah, it was a really bland decade, and the food was, crap. There are no black people in those Norman Rockwell paintings.
Yeah.
Not a lot of gay people in these movies.
Well, not outed, at least. I'm pretty sure.
Yes, statistics would show. Plus,
Yeah.
they're in the arts, and so.
Yeah, it is interesting. I say it does reflect in these films, because even films like I think really was the big surprise for me. Biggest disappointment, let me say. I enjoyed the film, and it was interesting for us to be able to make those comparisons to like Aliens, and like Tremors and those sort of like desert monster films in the first half. That was really interesting, but a film about giant ants and the atomics, this thing of nuclear fear, it's sort of like, it's like a passing thing in the film. Like it never really comes up where they're like, yes, this is the fear of the. It's mentioned, and then there's like a slight thing at the end of, they say like, well, how many of these bombs have we tested in the, in that sort of Nevada desert, and we don't know what's out there, which is fine, and it's in, but like the counter to this, I mean, them came out the same year as Godzilla,
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
and granted, it's almost like it's the counter to this thing of like, well, Gojira, Godzilla, is Japan dealing with the horror and the hangover of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's what Godzilla represents, this destruction and this nuclear sort of like flora. And in America, you get this sort of like not paper thin, but you get this sort of like entertaining things like, well, we were testing them over here before we destroyed a nation, and now, so I was expecting a sort of like, well, this is the price we pay for our nuclear
Mhm.
thing, it's almost like a remorseful film in some way or some kind of message. None of that, and I was really surprised by that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I mean, and essentially the acting agent in both them and Godzilla is the same, right?
Yeah.
But in Godzilla's rampage, you see these victims, right?
Mm.
I mean, them is cool with going through the tunnels in LA and everything, the storm tunnels, but it is exactly as you say. I mean, it's not just paper thin, it papers over even logical concerns, right? Even like, basic human empathy over these victims of these ants and stuff, or basic questions you'd ask. I mean, at the end, it ends with the point about like, well, how else is this going to happen, right? Is this going to happen to other species? Are we really in for it? But that's much more a sort of like, it feels like, oh, that's just teasing a possible sequel, or that's like a wink wink way to end the show, instead of Godzilla, which feels like a real movie. I mean, it feels devastating. When you see the wreckage caused by Godzilla, they don't shy away from
No.
the horror.
Yeah, and it was things like that I think when I was going into this, I was expecting. I could list off most of these where you sort of go, okay, well, I was expecting some sort of allegory or
Mm.
metaphor to be presented, at least in part of the film. Like again, Earth versus the Flying Saucers. When you have an Earth versus film, I was expecting again like, oh, this is going to be like a bit. I was expecting more invasion of the body snatchers than Mars Attacks. You know what I mean? I didn't realize I was watching the sort of like the basis for Mars Attacks, like
Yeah.
literally in some scenes. And again, going into that, I was expecting this thing of like you said about the missile gap and the jet the gap in that sort of thing, and this thing about this idea of we are short of technology against a greater foe.
Mm.
Is that what they're going to explore? Nope. Doesn't matter. But again, it's not. It's fine that it's not there. Not every film has to have a deep theme and something to say separate. Like sometimes I think they should. But it felt strange that these sort of like open goals were there, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, you didn't go there. That's fine.
Well, and I think that's where I come back to that idea of like papering over, right? That, like thinking about the the effect of nuclear weapons, them versus Godzilla, them is adamant about not thinking about it, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is an America that knew that what it was like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But, I mean, those reports had been published. That was not any big secret, but didn't want to think about it. Those are our bombs.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a side effect, but let's not think about it. Let's get our chocolate malt. I mean, that's not quite fair, but it's not exactly wrong either. And I think Earth versus the Flying Saucers, is the same way. There's a sort of like, those metaphors are right there. And you'd think, okay, well, I mean, this is also like putting it in the context of World War II. This is sort of like that American can-do spirit that's like, yeah, we're the plucky upstart nation that, hey, now we're on top of the world, bucko,
Yeah.
like, all right, reap the rewards. But there's no sort of nobody wants culturally, at least the scene in this part of American culture, to sort of stop and say, we got really lucky.
Yeah.
Not everybody else is really lucky. I mean, even in like Worlds Collide, the sort of myopia of, let's just put a boatload of white Americans on a plane and ship them to another planet. Good enough. Humanity will survive. There's nothing outside of America. I don't think you would have seen that in other decades.
No.
You certainly, I mean, before World War II, America was much more aware of itself as part of a continuity of nations,
Yeah, it seems, this idea of sort of like the exceptionalism as being the top dog. Like you said, they didn't want to rock the boat. And is it that like, papering over the cracks, I suppose, or papering over the obvious is probably exactly what it is, isn't it? It's that thing of like, we are the best at the moment. We are the top dog. Or at least, we are presenting ourselves as such. And we don't really want to have to highlight that, we may be the biggest nation, but we weren't here 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Or 30 years ago. Like, well, definitely 20 years previously, the Great Depression, we weren't in this position. So yeah, I suppose it is that sort of like grab it whilst it's there, sort of be that whilst it's there. So, I suppose.
And I mean, there's a kind of willfulness, is what I'm sort of saying about the sort of like not looking at the horrors of the bomb, right?
Yeah.
And, which was accurate to the time, right? I mean, there's a willfulness of not looking at Jim Crow, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's a willfulness in all of this. That the only anxiety that was sort of permitted in dominant, I mean, I hate using the word, but sort of like hegemonic, powerful, dominant American society, the only fear or anxiety that was acceptable was fear or anxiety of the communists, which was, a poor and broken country in Russia that had a lot of people, but was nowhere near us in terms of anything but people to throw at the Nazis. And again, not minimizing what Russia did in World War II. It won World War II as much or more than we did. But we built 100,000 bombers,
Yeah.
They threw, millions of people. And so, there's a sort of, but that's anxiety was permitted, but sort of the anxiety of like, yeah, we're depressed in our white suburbias that literally don't allow black people,
Yeah.
Obviously people are still gay. They're just closeted and killing themselves in a lot of places. Yeah, I mean, all of this is, is very, there's a sort of willful not looking at any of these problems that I find.
No, that's a good point. Like it's a sort of, we want to have this thing, but like I say, not look at what it, like I say, there's own goals, there's big open goals that they could do, which would clearly be there today. Going back to the one you said before, though, It Came From Outer Space is probably one of the ones that really does have this. And, there are several things that you can look at it there, like the way that the scientist approaches the aliens, the way that they sort of like he's the one that sort of like looking to have a peaceful discourse with them, and yes, there's some moments when like they'll use lasers and stuff, but it's us as like you said, as the humans, it's the trust issue and this other thing, like that's clearly in that film, and again, this idea even of the alien, where he says, the alien says about, well, we've had to imitate the people from your town because you can't handle the way we look. They get presented, and again, you could, well, we did, and you look at it and go, oh, that's a clear reference to, people, let's say, being closeted or hiding, whether it be political affiliations or sexual orientations or whatever. Like, it's almost like that, not so much in your face, but you can clearly see it's there. And I think that's one of the films I was like, oh, this is quite cool in that sense, that it's got those things.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that, I don't have a problem with an FX blockbuster. I mean, I think Earth versus the Flying Saucers is fine. I mean, it's a vehicle for Ray Harryhausen, and it is exactly what it wants to be. I think in some ways, like, that is more forgivable to me than them. which sort of skirts up against those issues and then avoids them, right? Willfully looks the other way. I think Earth versus the Flying Saucers is much. I mean, look, obviously them is, hey, look, giant ants, But Earth versus the Flying Saucers is just, yeah, watch Earth fight the flying saucers. I mean, and watch Ray Harryhausen's effects. There's a room for that, and I don't want to. I don't want to force all of cinema or comics or any art form to fit in a particular mold. And I don't think that any given movie should be, or comic or book should be forced to bear the weight of the entire culture, there's room for it. Having said that, it is telling that the one that I like the best is It Came from Outer Space, and it's exactly because of those things.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, like I say, Earth versus the Flying Saucers was good fun. It's Independence Day, sort of like 40 years before Independence Day. Like, it's clear where that model comes from. It's Independence Day. It's when Mars attacks. It's it's all that, and it's got some great moments. It's got some interestingly laughable moments, like when they say they're going to return those people, and they just push them off a spaceship, and they come crashing to Earth. Like,
there's a lot of that sort of like, we said one thing and now we're doing another. Like, the scene's not matching up quite.
Yeah. So yeah, it has good moments, and I quite enjoy it. There's some good bits to it, and again, will I watch it again? Yeah, if I come across it, I may end up watching it at some point in the future. But yeah, I agree. Like, I got more from It Came from Outer Space. Like, it's weirdly, like, it's a smaller film, but it has a much more sort of interesting take on that concept of a crashed spaceship. Like the fact that, like, they keep saying in the film, like, well, what if they aren't invading? Like, they might just be lost. Could have been an accident. Like, they've crash landed. Like, it's let's give them the opportunity. Like, it's not straight. Well, no, but there's that element of let's go straight to guns, and they sort of give the sort of the reason and justification behind it. And it tries to deal with it. So that it is much more of an interesting film.
Well, what do you make of the fact that I mean, we've got, we were talking about this in the context, these films in the context of American culture at that time, but we have a number of representatives from Britain. Do you see those as any different?
No, weirdly. So I did some reading about this because and it's sort of in there as to why Brian Dunleavy is cast as Quatermass, Mr. Angry Dunleavy. And reason I say so, those shows, or the BBC shows, are very different. They're told over 3 and a bit hours. There's a different pace. They've obviously got a different budget. Especially having watched the TV version of Quatermass 2 to compare to the TV version, and also knowing, having read, there's a book called the Vault of Hammer Horrors, and it sort of gives a bit of their history and stuff. And I've read bits and pieces in that, and like, they were clearly angling. They were a young studio, and they were angling for American distribution. They knew that, like, British distribution, this is going to do well in Britain anyway, because it's a Quatermass property, and people are probably going to see that because it's the movie version, although it's the same story. But they were really angling for that American market, and so they were looking to check the boxes. They was like, right, we can't have a British lead. We need to have an American lead that's at least partially known. So they get in Brian Dunleavy, and then they tried to tick those boxes of, like, this is entertainment, and that's what those are. I agree. Like, the Quatermass films don't really have a great deal to say. You watch the Quatermass 2 again. You watch the TV show, and there is clearly sort of commentary about the stuff I brought to when I talked about the film. This idea of bureaucracy and this idea of unionism, and blindly sort of doing a job because who cares about the outcome, because it means I can look after my family. That sort of stuff is clearly in the TV show, most definitely there, but is less so in the film. It's more like they pull back. there is that thing of like no one gives a crap about Welsh mining, politics of but you've got to lean into the story. So I do think it's there in there as well. I honestly think that that's the case. I enjoy those films. I really enjoy the Quatermass films, but there's less to be said there. I mean, the few things that you can take out of those. Well, no, it's almost counter in some ways, because one of the things I was thinking about was when you watch like Worlds Collide or when Worlds Collide in particular, is this idea of the optimistic use of technology. Like we can save these people by building this rocket. We have a way of doing these things, and it's an optimistic future in many ways, despite the fact the worlds are going to be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
Quatermass is like just a belligerent prick. He's like, yeah, I sent a rocket up without the right permits. What are you going to do about it? And I'm going to do it again. It's like
he really is the Elon Musk of the 1950s.
Yeah, very much so. Like, there's no sort of like this thing of doing it to. He hides behind this concept of doing it for the greater good, doesn't he? That's how it feels. Like it's more of an ego thing with Quatermass than it is, or at least the Brian Dunleavy version, than it is to sort of do this. And it's the same in Quatermass too. Like he sort of when he sees his moon in my head, when he sees his version of the moon set up, he sees it on sort of like the Norfolk Broads, and they're sort of there in front of him. We were sort of that must be terrifying to see your thing realized in this thing, like someone's taken it and built it. But there's a part of me that must be like, this Quatermass is going, hang on a minute, I've not been paid for this. Someone's going to get in trouble for this. Like he never comes across as the optimistic sort. So
he doesn't seem devastated. Like you'd think that he would sort of like stop and say, like those MFers, they stole my designs, like I'm proud of them. No, it's like you get the sense that, if not, like he's going to sue them or something, you get the sense that he's like, yeah, I don't control this. I don't mind that they built it, but they should have at least put me in charge of it.
Yeah, exactly. That's yeah. So with the British versions, with these films, it doesn't have that the use of that lack, that thing of not wanting to do the status quo. There's just a sort of grumpiness to them, to be perfectly honest. Like they're entertaining, but they're not looking to do anything other than be entertaining.
And so you attribute that primarily to sort of like targeting that American audience and knowing, you say like, well, strip it down to the story, but, not only casting an American lead, but also sort of, it doesn't take much to sort of see what the zeitgeist is in America as far as the rest of these films to say, well, I mean, partly you can't assume an American's going to be interested in, Welsh mining politics, right? But also, look what they're producing. We want them. We don't want, BBC.
Exactly, yeah. And that's what they're sort of leaning into. I think they were trying to lean into that. And the other thing to remember as well is when these Quatermass and Quatermass 2 were produced and distributed, like Hammer wasn't known for science fiction, horror, or
right.
It made its name with gothic horror. Like you'd had Dracula, Curse of Frankenstein, The Mummy. Like it was mainly like it was Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. And they had done some others. They'd sort of dabbled in thrillers. There's a film called The Snorkel, which I highly recommend. It's a very bizarre film. I highly recommend it. They'd done these things, but they're big blockbusters. The things that had made their name was these gothic horrors. And so they were trying to sort of hook the audience in using that Hammer title to do other things. And so they were very cautious, I think, by doing these films to say, well, we can't be too garish. I mean, the thing to note is as well, 51 is Dracula, 53 is Curse of Frankenstein, both in colour. Both of those are in colour. Quatermass and Quatermass 2 aren't.
Yeah.
So they were looking to hook the audience, but they weren't willing to spend the big bucks to do it. Is what we should really be highlighting. So these films are just them trying to they're trying to fill a gap, but they are trying to fill this sci-fi that's their thing, and it clearly worked because they went back and did Quatermass in the Pit in '67. So it's interesting that they knew these would sell in Britain. There was no problem there. So, but how can we get that wider distribution? And it was clearly on the American market. Like that, I feel that those films, the Quatermass Experiment in particular, fits in with the rest of these films. Like I can feel that there's a style there, or that fits with those other films. Like I could imagine that the Quatermass Experiment being fully made as an American film in this period. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree. I keep thinking about how, having seen Quatermass in the Pit, which is from '67, I mean, it's 10 years after Quatermass 2. It does feel, especially in thinking about it in this discussion, like it's from a different world than the '50s stuff. It is still a sort of like compelling story. Yeah, obviously different lead, right? But it's still a sort of compelling story rooted in a sci-fi concept. But it's the '60s, and so it's allowed to sort of like go weird and go, all these, places, and it asks questions. I mean, it's existentially terrifying in a way that these two aren't. I mean, these are sort of like the idea that, I mean, really, the idea that we come from Mars and that there's this sort of like Lovecraftian alien in Quatermass in the Pit. There's no reason why that inherently should be more terrifying or upsetting than there are aliens in orbit waiting to possess us, right? And as soon as we go into outer space, we're going to get possessed and be confronted by these beings who we cannot even see or control, right? That should be terrifying. And yet it really doesn't feel that way. It feels like it's the vehicle for another 50 sci-fi plot.
Yeah, exactly. It depends. It's that leaning, isn't it? Like the Quatermass in the Pit leans into the existential terror. That's what it's done. But and again, you go back to the Quatermass Experiment and the Quatermass 2, which probably leans a little bit, but it's more about the monsters, where they're like, okay, we've got to show gory concept or gory, you want to see, especially the Quatermass Experiment, where it's like, as you say, from a Fantastic Four kind of thing, you're going to go through solar radiation or whatever, and you're going to be melded together and then slowly become a sort of like a plant animal creature. That transformation is, they're not even focused on the dread of that. It's just now he's attacking another person and he's, now his arm's gone thingy and that sort of thing. To take that to its next conclusion is The Fly. Cronenberg's The Fly, really, is this thing of sort of like, how is this guy dealing with this fact of his body's sort of rebelling against him? Other films have done it and done it better, but it's where the Hammer films are leaning, isn't it? It's about monster in Experiment, and then in Quatermass 2, it's more about the sort of the mystery, isn't it? It's leaning into this idea of it being a mystery rather than the fact that, like you say, oh no, there's an alien species that's on the far side of the moon, and is sending little missiles to take people over. It's that should be, terrifying, but
or they've gotten possession of basically the British government. And they have installations they're mole people. They've weeded their way into our society. They're already at a point where they could conceivably take over the world. This should be,
it should be
conceivably scary stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that should be Invasion of the Body Snatchers, shouldn't it? That should be who do you trust, and all that kind of stuff. And then you could lean into the Cold War fears and all that kind of stuff. But there's none of that, especially this idea of being possessed by something that's been brought over, this idea of propaganda or, being turned or whatever. But it's not. It's about the monsters and it's about the sort of the ideas. And so, I do think they definitely were leaning into that.
American superficiality.
Yeah, and I would love.
That's what my country does best. I mean, the phrase "American superficiality" just rolls off the tongue.
Well, it makes me wonder. I know how not Nigel Neal was devastated. The creator of Quatermass was devastated when they cast an American as Quatermass. Unfortunately, like he'd written the first and second TV series as part of a contract for the BBC, so he didn't own the character and no rights over it, so they could do what the hell they want with it, as could Hammer. But I've never been able to find an interview or anything with him where he was able to sort of, other than to say, I'm not a fan of the Hammer films, but like to say, like, I'd love to have asked him, like, let's get into it a little bit, like this discussion, like, what are your feelings about? Do you think they downplay the ideas that you really wanted to present in these stories with Quatermass and that sort of thing? I'm pretty sure you watch those TV shows, Quatermass 1's difficult because it's only 2 episodes exist, but having watched Quatermass 2 and the TV version of Quatermass in the Pit and the TV and the film version, like he definitely lent more towards that existential dread and that sort of the ideas. That's where Neil was going, but it gets compacted and it gets made packaged up to become a little bit more presentable to TV's to a 90-minute runtime and an international audience.
Yeah. I was going to say that it's interesting that I agree with you. I think it's interesting that for 2 movies that have a lot of possession going on, with rare exceptions, it's really only the Quatermass Experiment that does any of this, of sort of depicting any kind of interior space to the people being possessed. In Quatermass 2, it's just there are hordes, right? And they might as well be like James Bond, the hordes of James Bond villain goons, no interior space. There's no struggle.
They even refer to them as the zombies, don't they, in the film? So they have. There's no point worrying about them. They're just the zombies. Yeah.
Yeah, kill them. Whereas Quatermass Experiment, that's some of the stuff that I like the most is sort of that scientist wandering around and sort of hiding and sort of struggling with his wounds and stuff like that. He still doesn't talk about it. There's still no real. There's a little bit of sympathizing with him, but he isn't really granted a full emotional range. But that's another thing that's sort of interesting to me as far as willfully ignoring, the implications of your own plot.
Well, willfully ignoring the outcome is exactly what Quatermass does in this film. He completely, he deals with the problem, but at no point, the wife of one of the astronauts calls him out and says, like, you have had no thought or consideration for the fact that these are 3 men that were sent up, and eventually they've all died. Like, you've not given it any thought or consideration. And he sort of just looks at her, just sort of with a little bit of disdain, and sort of like, that's it. And that's all the film gives it. Like, he doesn't stop at any point to sort of show remorse or reflect on the events that have led to this. For him to say, lessons learned. We need to do things different. He just, at the end of it, he literally walks off, having said, "And now I shall launch my next rocket." You're like, "Oh, right, okay, well." You were totally willfully ignoring the problem.
Well, I mean, I like that phrase, lessons learned, right? Because isn't that the epitome of every character arc, right? I mean, if there is a character arc. And looking back on these films, what films are any lessons learned in?
Yeah.
When worlds collide, like, I guess listen to the scientists when they say the world is ending, I mean, Earth versus the flying saucers, what are you going to do? You have better guns? I mean, what is the lesson you learned? It Came from Outer Space is the only one where I could say there's a lesson to be learned, which is like, don't distrust immediately,
Well, I'd even say that the main character learns that lesson. That's the sort of, at least that's that they do have an arc. I think that's one of the few films that does have an arc in this collection. I mean, when worlds collide, I mean, the only other thing it had was basically yes, happily manipulate industrialist billionaires to take their money. I think that's the only other
Yeah.
lesson from that film, really.
Yeah, that's true, right?
Yeah.
Screw the capitalists. I mean, one of those people might have been Quatermass. Uh,
Yeah.
although he probably would have said he would have drawn the contract so that he owned the rocket and he would have pranced in and demanded control. He wouldn't be like that guy in the wheelchair who just passively accepts, that he can't control it.
Yeah. Well, he probably built his own rocket, to be perfectly honest. Just him and 3 other people.
As one does.
Yeah. So really, the only one we haven't really touched on that is actually probably the odd one out of this bunch, and was mine. It was my contribution mainly because I wanted to get a Vincent Price film in. Is The Tingler, and it acts less as a sort of sci-fi film. It's more of a sort of a sci-fi horror oddity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But again, like that film, this film epitomizes everything we've been saying. Really, like this film has really got nothing to say. Barely has a coherent plot, but it's more about that experience. It's about having the cinema experience, isn't it? It's an entertainment driver. So it's a, I think as we said in the episode, it's a bit more of it's a ride, rather than a piece of, no. I don't want to downplay it. I don't say it's not a piece of art, but it's definitely more designed to be an experience than something to make you go home and think about.
Well, and I think, okay, so it's a gimmick, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the selective use of color is a gimmick. I mean, the shocker of, the chairs, and whatnot, vibrating and, the, turning off the lights in the cinema and saying it's in the cinema. Having said that, those are all also kind of brilliant, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, I'm not comparing, the tingler in our spines to the Holocaust by any means. But, when Spielberg used selective color in Schindler's List, it's, seen as an artistic choice. This is clearly not an artistic choice in that same way. But I do think that Tingler holds up in a way better than most of these other films, in the sense that, like, Ray Harryhausen, you sort of feel like, I guess this is true for the Tingler too, but you sort of feel like, okay, just get to those Ray Harryhausen scenes, right?
Yeah.
Like, I know you paid a lot of money for them and you have to pad this out to get to a 90-minute runtime. With the Tingler, yeah, I mean, sure, a lot of it is just Vincent Price, having weird relationships, and I don't know how any of them work. But I do think that because it's metafictional, I do think that those gimmicks in the Tingler, in an odd way, kind of hold up and make that film stand out and stand the test of time in a weird way, despite its stupidity as a plot.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are 2 main segments in the film that sort of like stand up in that way. Like I say, the bathroom or the fear-inducing scene. With the spoilers we've already talked about, where the husband is setting up his wife to die from fear, is excellent. It's silly as hell, but it's brilliant. I mean, I don't even know how he did half the things, but again, like with Castle using, like, because the film's been in black and white and it's been played relatively campy, straight, but leaning into the camp for the most part. But then the moment she turns on the taps and you see like the red blood water come out, and then she turns around to the bathtub and the hand reaching out of the water, the blood, whatever, is incredibly effective. And the fact that you've had some sort of like slightly silly leads up to that, like a guy in a mask walking to it, but it's all effective. That's no different to like Michael Myers. That's idea of the character, but then the end bit in particular, like you say, in the cinema, this idea of the Tingler is now loose in the cinema, and the film actively engages with the audience is wonderful. Like, I really enjoy that.
Yeah, that's what gave me a tingle was, like when it disappears down the vent, and my brain goes, oh, I see what you're doing here. Like, this is quite charming, and there aren't a lot of moments like that in cinema, period. You get one of those in a movie, you're usually pretty happy. But certainly in this section. I was going to say, it's not just Michael Myers. I mean, if Hitchcock had done that blood sequence, we'd still be talking about it today as, an artistic tour de force. But because it's William Castle and it's the Tinkler, and granted, the movie is not great as a movie, but because it's seen as just a gimmick for the sake of the gimmick, it's not remembered and talked about for those artistic accomplishments. But it has those artistic accomplishments in it.
Oh, yeah, I agree. Psycho comes out the following year. And you've already had, so the Hitchcock was already well established really by this point, but Psycho comes out the next year. And again, one of the things we talked about was this almost like a break from like 1960 onwards. There seems to be this sort of division, Psycho, 2001. There's a film called Peeping Tom, which is a very similar film to Psycho. And all of a sudden, cinema takes this sort of leap. And people look at this stuff from that era and go, oh yeah, look, that was fully intentional. Look at the shower scene in Psycho, and you go, yeah, it's good. It is good. But there was still stuff going on before that. That they had a different intent, but they were just as creative and just as that final sequence of the breaks and the Tingler being appearing in the cinema is just as effective to me. I mean, I'm not saying it's as artistically well shot or anything like that, but it's still as effective as some of the things done in Psycho. It just has a different objective.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
But yeah, it is interesting that sort of people seem to have, maybe in my own mind, I have this like demarcation of like, well, modern cinema started in 1960. Well, it's never that simple, is it? But
no, it's not. I mean, and we talked about stuff pre-50s that's fantastic, that just lives in my mind forever. So I think that's not only is that a sort of superficial analysis, but also, like you say, the sort of like trend lines, the tendrils of all of these things go back and will go forward, and none of it is as pat as we like to make it.
Yeah. So I think really when we've gone through them all, I think it was a good bunch. I mean, again, like I say, they haven't got masses to say, but then again, the decade may not have had a great deal to say, to be perfectly honest. It sounds a bit, we said that it was trying to keep its head down. I mean, I think the 50s has more impact as a form of nostalgia than it does as an actual historical decade. I mean, like you've said, all those films, like, everything from Grease to half of Stephen King, sort of, he was massively, obviously that was when he was growing up. He's a baby boomer. He's that's the sort of summer of his youth, I suppose. So it's quite interesting to see that sort of it probably exists. Back to the Future, another one. This idea of it acts, and ironically, the 80s acts in a very similar way for us now.
I was going to say that I don't think the 80s are as extreme. I mean, I do think that you get some deeper themes even in the trivial 80s stuff. In a way that this batch of films doesn't have. Having said that, that is a sort of, it is parallel in American history, this sort of like, it's the Reagan effect, right? Where like just being rich is good, right? Like greed is good, is Gordon Gekko. And, and there was this sort of like, desire to return to the 50s and to this period where, we believed in ourselves and America was the best country in the world. And, we didn't have to ask those difficult questions and, depicting having people question themselves when they encounter alien life. Why, that's tantamount to questioning the entire American experiment, don't you know? And so there is a kind of like return in the 80s to that sort of willfully dumb stuff.
Well, is it a coincidence that the 80s president was a 50s actor?
Right.
You know.
Yeah. Right. Well said.
Yeah, and it is interesting. Both decades,
And,
you know,
and an idiot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is quite interesting that, you know, the 80s definitely. I think, you know, and maybe I defend it because it's the decade I grew up in. But to me, I think the 80s is definitely a more politically active decade. And you're right. I think we'd already entered into modern cinema, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes out of the 80s that's very, you know, has got a lot to say. But both are sort of also you know, preceded by a decade of, you know, counterculture. You get the 50s is followed by the counterculture movement and the hippies and everything of the 60s, and then the 80s is very much sort of followed by the rave culture and the sort of happy clappy scene of the 90s. And both follow sort of like UFO spats. So the 60s was full of them, and so was the 90s. So it's interesting, actually. I'm not going to go off on this tangent. This is but
well, it's
yeah.
true. The same way that sort of like every election is about the previous one, right? You know, every decade is a reaction to the previous one, you know, and has to be understood in that context.
Yes, definitely. And you know, I recently watched. I've been watching some of the X-Files. In that, and you can see some of that. You know, that reaction to the excessive 80s. In that, you know, there's got, you know, it's very much a different show. It's very a 90s show, but it's still of its time. But that's a different story altogether.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, you know, it'd be interesting, you know, as we go on and we see more 50s movies as we choose them and insert them in movies earlier and movies of the 60s, which I think we haven't represented enough. We will be able to use this block as a kind of touchstone, you know,
yes,
to sort of like, okay, well, we've seen Godzilla, we've seen Forbidden Planet, you know.
Yeah.
We've seen maybe It Came from Outer Space, you know, but we've also seen sort of like a nice cross section where we have this sort of reference point for what the 50s was about in sci-fi, you know, positively and negatively.
Yeah, it's like, well, here's the baseline, and then we get the waves beyond, you know, within that to see what the parameters really are. But yeah, I think
you want to do ratings?
You know, yes, I was going to say, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to move into the ratings? We've got them in the. We'll obviously follow them in the usual chronological order. And I'll let you go first because I think it was your choice. So we'll start with in 1951, When Worlds Collide.
Yeah, I gave this one a 5.5. So, you know, I think that it's well done for what it is. You know, I think it's known as one of the sort of seminal 50s films, and that was, you know, a reason why I chose it. It's well reviewed even today, but you know, as we say, I mean, I think it's got a lot of funny absurdities in its plot, you know, and it's sort of whitewashing of the globe that don't hold up today. And, you know, I mean, it's a functional movie, but very much limited. And so, in terms of its plot. And so, yeah, I gave it a 5.5. What about you?
Yeah, I was about thinking the same. I actually gave it a 5. And I think mainly because there's bits of it I really like, but there's also parts of it that were just very clunky. And the bits that sort of chucklesome really is the sort of your main guy at the beginning. He was literally sort of like a pilot, you know, just seems to become like the main character just by being there. There's no real narrative reason for him other than to be sort of like, yeah, you just happen to be there, so you can carry on. But also like the turn at the end, like this realization by all the people that have been building the rocket, like, hang on a minute, what do you mean we're not going? And then they all riot. Like it just sort of happens.
We've never thought about this before.
Yeah,
they're stirred up by the rabble rouser.
There's never been a rabble rouser before, and that was part of the thing we said. Sort of like, Narratively, it's obviously of its time, fine, but it was just clunky. It just sort of like things just kept happening. I was like, it needs to be a bit smarter. So yeah, just a 5 for me. Still good though. Still good. Okay, It Came from Outer Space, 1953.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I gave this a 6. I gave this a 6.5.
Oh wow. Okay, so this is also my. Was this your highest rated?
Joint.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, don't spoil it. This was my highest rated, and I gave it a 6. So we're within 0.5 of each other, but you know.
Again, there was just something about this film that, to me, it had like a rewatchability. Where I know I could go back and I was like, if I was to watch this again, I wasn't bored watching this film. I don't think I was bored watching many of them, but I wouldn't be bored rewatching this film. And I think because it has something to say, and also because, I mean, there's some silly bits in it, like when they do take on the identities and the personas of the people from the town. It's like, well, why are you wearing boiler suits? Why are you talking funny? Like it's there's some silly bits in it.
Mm-hmm.
But I do kind of the finale of the film, that third act, is really good. It's sort of like that race against time and the fact he wants to save the people, and he's got to outpace the sheriff and his goons and all this other stuff. It's all really good. I think it's a really good. There's bits of it that are just really good. So yeah, I think this is one of the ones I'd probably go back to out of the bunch.
Yeah, no, I agree with your assessment. I mean, my thinking is that I'm looking back, and I gave Star Wars a 6, Akira a 6, Flash Gordon a 6, Quatermass in the Pit a 6, Mars Attacks, Minority Report. 6 is sort of like, okay, it's above average. There are definitely things to recommend it, but it's not. When you get into like 7, we're into like The Fly, Starship Troopers, Barbarella, Rocky Horror. I'm just talking about my ratings, like Videodrome, Transformers the movie. I mean, so for me, I felt like 6 is sort of that. Oh, I respect this. This is above average. There's definitely reasons to see this. It's not, especially painful. I can legitimately recommend this, but it's not quite at that 7 level. So,
no, yeah, I know what you're saying. So okay,
we're pretty close there.
Yeah. So you give it a 6. Is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So what about Them from 1954? What did you give them?
So it's interesting. I gave them a 5, and this is actually my worst rating for the season, right? So that tells you everything is within 5 and a 6, so not a lot of surprises. So this was, and to me, like a 5 is slightly below average. It's sort of, I mean, if we're talking like 1 to 10, it's 6 is slightly above, 5 is slightly below. And I felt like there's a lot of good stuff, like all of the stuff that I really appreciate about them is either the giant ants, which I don't see enough of, in those caves and stuff. I mean, they're good, but it's all sort of like, oh, this reminds me of Aliens, or this is like you've staged this in a cool way, but there's something about it that, I don't feel like, oh my God, I hope they're not going to die. In fact, they're dying left and right, and I don't care, and it's not even done dramatically and effectively. And so there's certainly things about the staging of this that I appreciate, but I wind up, it's like, fast food where, I think like, yeah, that's okay, but am I ever going to think about, those sequences in the ant tunnels ever again? I don't know. I doubt it. Maybe when I watch Alien. Outside of that, what about you?
Yeah, I actually gave it. I have a joint score with this, but I give it a 4.5 for exactly the same reasons you've said. Is that like there's bits of this are good, but they tell you the cooler stuff than you actually see.
Mm-hmm.
So like at one point they talk about the fact that they're flying ants, and they attack a boat, and I'm like, that sounds really cool. And then but you see them on the boat doing stuff, but I'm like, yeah, but come on, I want to see a flying ant. Like, I want to see a massive flying ant, and you never see
do
those
we
kinds of
not
things.
see one like super briefly when it enters with a jet, like sees that ant and says like, "Oh, it's heading out west" or something?
No, it's
Is there
all
not
done like. No, they have a voiceover thing, and it's done
Oh.
on a map. They just
Oh,
show you on
okay.
a map, and they show you like a
Not good.
radius of where. Yeah, and so there's things like that they constantly willing to show. And also the fact is that the film to me felt like two films. Like I think they said the first film they blow up this nest, and then they're like, and they've escaped. And you're like, okay, well, why are you now going to have this almost like this whole second half that's clearly like a second film in the city, like. And as I said before, this film feels like Tremors, and then another film, and it's sort of like it's just that disjointedness about it that bothered me. So yeah, 4.5 was sort of the answer cool, but
that's going to be on the movie poster, the back of the DVD. Well, the ants are cool, Scott Weatherly. No, I mean, that thing about the movie being split, I think. It comes off as, well, we didn't have enough plot, so we're just going to do more of this. Whereas I think that if you have, we were talking earlier about the lack of, being about anything. And I think if you have that in a script, then I usually want to see more. Right? I want to see the aftermath. I want to see how this changes society. I want to see, even just like, if you're the lone survivor of an encounter with aliens or ants or whatever, what does that do to you over time? Are you the expert that, is like, they're still coming. You've got to listen to me. I mean, I'm fine. I want to see that stuff, but because there's no meaning to anything here. There's no real message or stakes or real characterization. It just feels like a tacked on sequel, as you say, instead of like an exploration of, look, make that entire second half, focused on the characters and the characters struggling with what they've been through or something, Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know.
They literally have that in the film that they go to that hospital and you have the crazy person who sort of like, make me a sergeant. That person sort of like should be the survivor of the last film. Like that's how it should work. Like, we've now been attacked. We need to go see the person who survived it, but he was driven crazy by the encounter. But it's not just about having something to say. The film, especially the first half, the whole thing when it's in the desert and you have the thing and it ends up with them basically firing on an anthill in the middle of the desert. That's Tremors. And you can make that film work if you've got a charming, enjoyable cast. If you want to spend time with those characters, then it works. If you don't, and the writer clearly didn't give a monkeys about the characters, then it doesn't work. So, yeah. But we spent a lot of time on them. So yeah, to me, it just felt like it's a seminal film. It gets mentioned a lot, but it's not one of the. It's all right. It's fine, but it's not one I think I'll go back to.
No, I agree, and I think that that's an excellent point about the that crazy person should have been the survivor, and and that would have been if you pull a sort of like Mars Attacks where the protagonist from the first half is in a mental institution, then you go, wow, like that's surprising, but it's not, they don't even return to that character who your main characters really do wrong by, you never find out like, one of us should probably call that mental institution and have that guy released, it doesn't matter, right? The filmmakers don't care.
No, exactly. Okay. So the next one then, the Quatermass Experiment, 1955. I gave this a 6. Mainly because I think I've just got a real nostalgia for it. I'm blatantly aware of its shortcomings, especially in the form of Brian Dunleavy, and in its finale. And I understand that sort of we talked about this thing about making it more appealing to audiences to have the beast electrified or the alien electrified and burnt. It kind of looks kind of cool, but it's not what was intended. But I just really enjoy this film. I think it's I've obviously got a soft spot for Quatermass, and I do enjoy this film despite its flaws. There's some really good. I like the stuff like the chase and the mystery part of it.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I think there's more mystery, as you said, in Quatermass too. I mean, so I gave this a 5.5, right? So again, I mean, we're within 0.5 of each other, right? All along. That's been the gap in everyone so far. Not surprising that this would be me 0.5 lower. I think what sticks with me because of the nostalgia, I think what sticks with me is the opening sort of mystery, right? Of sort of like the crash ship and like, where did these two astronauts disappear to? Yeah, you pointed out, and I hadn't thought of it, rightly so, that the ship is right side up, and there's sort of like some awkwardness there of the staging of that rocket crash. But it is a sort of like classic 50s sort of thing, and at least it has that sense of mystery. Whereas a lot of these, the mystery is sort of like, yeah, those are aliens visiting you, right? This is like, well, what happened to those two astronauts? Why is he the other survivor? How did he survive, and why is he acting strange? So I think that sort of initial setup sticks with me. And then the second thing that sticks with me is Westminster, and the alien inside it as a monster that they burn, but just being in the rafters during the BBC shoot. But there's something about seeing that truly alien-looking monster in a cathedral that is, in a sense, is gothic, right? In the sense of like atmosphere. But those are the two things that really stick with me about the film.
Yes, no, I agree. And I will go back to this one. All right, and we're moving on. Earth versus the Flying Saucers, 1956. What did you give this one?
I gave this a 5.5, and only because of, I mean, I could see going to 5 on this. I mean, I think only because of the Ray Harryhausen stuff, and that I feel that it, if you accept that it's a, it is what it is. If you accept it's a sort of like FX vehicle, okay. I mean, it's very middle of the road. It's not offending me, but it's doing what it's doing. And I do think it's kind of like the template for Mars Attacks. It's more than any other film that we've seen. It is the template for 1950s retro sci-fi stuff. What about you?
Yeah, I actually gave it. This is my joy. This is matching them. I gave this 4.5. Again, like I said, the Harryhausen stuff's good, but it's one of those things of like the Harryhausen stuff that you get is literally a moving flying saucer, and there's some when they attack, it's like there's a few buildings that fall down. I'm thinking like it's good, but it's not like Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, or it's not something where I'm getting like creatures and like they're not fighting a Cyclops or Clash of the Titans where he's taking on like a horde of skeletons. Like, it's fine, it's good, it looks fine, but it's the fact that, like you say, unfortunately, I think, and maybe this because of the order I've seen these in, I could not stop thinking that, especially at the end when they shoot down. There's several scenes that like they shoot down the Washington Monument, and I'm like, oh, like that's where Mars Attacks got it from. Like, it's blatant, like. And it just kept making me think of the films, and the same with like Independence Day. Where I'm like, I know Independence Day is exactly this film, but it's it's a stunt, it's a special effects movie. But because I've seen that first, I just kept thinking about that, and it just kept making me think like, I should watch Independence Day. Like, I know it's not good, but like I should go and watch that film. And actually, like now I've watched this, I can appreciate Mars Attacks better and this other stuff. So. It acts almost like as a cornerstone, as a historical cornerstone to go, that's what this is. And it makes me appreciate other things more, but it didn't make me appreciate this, if that makes sense.
I think that's actually very fair. And I think that part of my if anything, I've erred slightly higher because I mean, I don't think that I would go. I mean, you did them and Earth versus the Flying Saucers at 4.5 because my lowest is them at 5. Like, I mean, it's doing what it's doing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would feel reluctant to go lower than that. I mean, just subjectively, I look back, if there's one that I look back on and think, kind of groan in my head, it's them. Despite wanting to love it. I mean, I love giant ants. I love the planetary issue with that, and I love every pastiche of that. And so maybe this is sort of like in that category where the pastiche and the homage is sort of better than that original. But there's something about the Ray Harryhausen thing, that is maybe slightly more tolerable. I probably should have gone like 5.25 or something, but I'm on record already. I shall not take it back.
No. Well, it's thing. I think we said it in. I've said that what I've said about Earth vs. Flying Saucers. Those films. With them, this idea of the giant creatures, like eight-legged freaks, from the early 2000s with David Arquette. Like, it's a comedy film. Like, it leans into it, and I think them is also like, as I said, Tremors. This has been taken and done, and I've seen those other films and Aliens. Like we talked about Aliens being taken. If I've seen those and then I go back to this, that you can go up to them, you go, oh, okay, yeah, that's where it's come from. But unfortunately, I saw those first, so downgrades these.
That gets into a legitimate question that I often think about art and about reviewing in particular, which is, how much do we prize originality and how much does stuff change over time, right? Like, obviously, there are movies that you look back on and you say, yeah, this was really stupider than I remembered. And it's also really sexist and racist, Yeah. And, here it's sort of like, yeah, I mean, there is the problem of, I don't think anyone will look back and say Earth versus the Flying Saucers is a masterpiece, right? I mean, it's just not. But if it was influential, and I do think that in art, we often, in the West, we overly prize being original and getting there first. And sometimes it's like, look, that movie is a template for better movies that came later. It's not great in itself, but it had a decent idea. It did something well. Or do you say, well, it is really influential? I mean, that's part of my fudge factor is, it's really influential. I get why it would be influential. It did that kind of thing first, or, was an early example of that. So, I mean, I'm giving it a little bit of a fudge upward because of that influence, and you're giving it, if anything, a bit of a fudge downward because, it's like everything I'm getting from this, I have seen done better. Maybe that better stuff was influenced by this.
Yeah, very much so. And again, I think if we were to take like The Fly, for example, which has a genuine remake, we talk about Vincent Price in a minute, but you take the original 50s version from 58, and then you watch the 80s version, the Cronenberg version. Like, I like both, but the idea of someone being taken by a fly, Cronenberg did it way better. Like, the first one's original in that sense. Well, possibly not. It's science. It's mad scientists taking over, but it's been done elsewhere. But yeah, I think sometimes things are done better, and an idea is taken. And this is why I have no problems with remakes, because sometimes like a remake, as long as someone's got got a good idea or a different take, I'm like, yeah, go for it. Let's see what it looks like. Anyway, let's we shall. In fact, we're going to deal with that in this season with Vanilla Sky and.
Oh yes.
So
open your eyes.
Open your eyes. So we shall return to this discussion actually around originality.
Well, not to mention Little Shop of Horrors is technically a remake too. Yeah. Yeah.
So we are going to be sort of touching on that a little bit. Okay, next one then. So 57, we Quatermass 2. First film to use a numeral in its title.
That's right.
And I gave it 6.5.
Wow. So you think it's better than Quatermass 1? I mean, since this is something we both are like on the record, we got to make that decision. We sort of debated it in that episode. But now we actually have to rank it, have to give a numerical score. Is it better than the first?
Yeah, I really reflected on this because I was like, is it better? And if it is, why is it? And I do really like the first one, as I've sort of said. This is a 0.5 higher. The mystery and the breadth of the second film, it feels like a suitable sequel. Like, you know, it's bigger, it's slightly more, it's different. It's still an alien. It's a different type of alien invasion. It doesn't try and retread the things that it's already done, but it starts to sort of grow the breadth of what Quatermass is doing. Like, you know, you actually have like bureaucratic involvement in, you know, you've actually got governmental involvement in this. He's got to report someone. He's got things. Dunleavy's better in this one as well. Like, he's clearly toning down the arsehole, which is good.
I can put that on a t-shirt. Toning down the asshole.
And it just feels like there's just something more rounded about this film. Like, it's not just them chasing down a monster. Like, they've got to infiltrate the plant. You know, there's actually like negotiations. There's the thing of like, you know, granted, again, something we've said, like, you know, you don't see it on screen, which is disappointing, but it was the 50s. But like the concept of they killed and pulped people to block a pipe, you know, and they find the blood trickling out. Like, that is, like, to me, even now, like, that stays with me. So, and the storming of the plant when everyone's getting shot up and stuff, like, you know, and stuff. So, you know, this one just felt like a more grander plan and a better constructed film.
Interesting. I guess I disagree. I gave it a 5.25. So I gave it 0.25 lower than the first.
Yeah.
And I feel like the first one is the better film. You know, and I sort of waffled back and forth and had it made up my mind in discussing Quatermass 2. I think that first one stays with me more. I think the second one is a more focused narrative, but the only thing that really stays with me from 2 is the sort of mystery of they've built my design, and you know, that's legitimately creepy, even if they don't play it up as much as I would like. I do think that, you know, and then one thing that both of these films do really well is they immediately throw you into the action. But I think Quatermass Experiment does that even faster and better. You know, and then in Quatermass 2, you're very quickly in sort of like, oh, okay, you're right that it ups the stakes, but I sort of feel like, oh, we're in a Bond film now, and now you're escaping, and, you know, he's doing this sort of like infiltration stuff, and, you know, and you're right that the film is sort of a more focused narrative. But some of the stuff that I like about Quatermass Experiment, especially with like that guy wandering around and encountering the girl with the doll, very Frankenstein-like, is that it lets itself go on those little digressions, and it's, you know, I mean, it's quieter. It's you know, it is a smaller film. But, you know, I don't think the visual of that monster sort of reeling, you know, rising over the plant at the end of Quatermass 2, while I mostly think of it as prefiguring Quatermass in the Pit. Whereas I think the monster in the cathedral in Quatermass Experiment works much better for me.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying.
But you're wrong, Julian.
No. Yeah.
Shame, you ignorant slut.
I definitely agree with the finale, and you know, I mean, I like the chase element of Experiment. You know, this idea of having to sort of go and that they're constantly on the back foot. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's something about 2 that, with the involvement of the village and this idea of this protectionist, you know, attitude where they're sort of like, you know, don't rock the boat, and the fact that like the government been invaded and stuff, like I almost see like a precursor to like the X-Files and stuff for this as well, you know, these sort of ideas. So yeah, it just sort of it has a bit more for me in 2. I think we can both happily agree though that Quatermass in the Pit is still the best of the 3.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Without a doubt.
Let me look back and see, you know, what we. Okay, so Quatermass in the Pit, you gave an 8 and I gave a 6.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's we both did better than either of us.
So last on the list, and so yeah, you give 5.25. So the last one is the Tingler from 1959. So what did you give the Tingler?
I gave the Tinkler a 5.5. So right in line with When Worlds Collide, Quatermass Experiment, Earth versus the Flying Saucers. I want to go higher on this. Like my tendency is to go higher on this, but because I love that metafiction. I love the blood scene, but especially that metafiction. I think it's because metafiction came into vogue in a later period. It feels very much ahead of its time, even if it was a gimmick. And so I want to go higher. But that plot is so damn horrible. It's so, there's a substance in our spine that grows and hardens and it never even explains like why it's a being. Like we evolved in a symbiotic relationship with fear monsters that grow to titanic proportions in our spine that would distend our backs. I mean, it really is so incoherent as a plot. I mean, and I would feel bad if like I rated this a 6 and then people were like, oh, like Julian likes this. I should watch it. And then they're like, what is wrong with Julian? So anyway, so that's why I went 5.5. What about you?
I also gave it a 5.5. Although it's it's a prize film, and I do love my prize movies. The fact of the matter is, like, you're right, it's incoherent nonsense. This film, like it's clearly set up to just be the ride. And of all the prize films, it's not even in probably my top 10. It's good, it's fine. He's fine in it, but of the Price and William Castle collaborations, House on Haunted Hill is a much better film. And as an overall, it just has a funness to it though. And like I said, I do really like that end bit, and I do love the use of color in the bathtub and the taps and stuff like so. And there's also a charm to the special effects. I was watching this on Blu-ray. It's a 4K restoration, and there are certain films when you're like, you shouldn't be doing that to a film. Like, you don't need to see this in that much clarity because the strings are probably obvious on a projected screen.
Yes.
On a high pixelated restoration, like they are blatant. But it's still fun. It's still got good moments, and I enjoy it. But like you say, this weird thing of like the fact that his wife hates him, but they've never left each other, and then the younger couple and this other stuff, and it's and
they're murdering each other. I mean,
yeah,
that stuff is so bizarre.
Yeah, with this and Haunted Hill, like I said it in the episode, and I'll say it again, like I need to know more about William Castle's love life or his married life because in both of them it's about killing off. It's kind of about killing off spouses. So yeah, he clearly had some issues to work through.
Well, I've always said that, I mean, it's like they say, the couple that slays together stays together. And if you're not slaying outwardly, you're going to be slaying in the home. I mean, that's just a fact.
That's very true. Very true. But yeah, it's.
I think you're right about Vincent Price, though, that, in case you were wrapping up, I don't mean to interrupt. I just that, Vincent Price is entertaining to watch, but this feels like he's underutilized, if anything. If that makes sense.
Oh yeah. It's not even like you say, it's not a top 5. I recently did on 20th Century Geek. I did my top 5 prize films, and House on Haunted Hill is probably one of my favorite. The same year, and he's utilized much better in that film. But yeah, I could go off on a whole tirade, like Witchfinder General and Theatre of Blood. But yeah, it's still good fun. It's a great idea, and it's a bit like we talked about Harryhausen. It's more about Castle. This is about William Castle and his ideas of cinema entertainment than the actual film. Like his other films, like the use of like 3D and I forget the name of the effects, but he used for like 13 Ghosts, and which has got like optics in the film. Or when he did Haunted Hill, and he had like skeletons and things running through the cinema, like it's an experience, and so I think that's kind of cool. But yeah,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is one that, like, I mean, so I think It Came from Outer Space is the best of the season. You know, you've got that tied with Quatermass too. I will say that if you know, I mean, Earth versus the Flying Saucers is so definitive of the era. You know, I mean, them is a harder slog, even though it's pretty definitive. But if there's one movie for me that you're gonna see from the set, actually, it may well be The Tingler, because The Tingler is just so different that I feel really thankful that you added it. You know, it's like part of cinema history that should be taught. You know, that it was doing this thing.
Yeah, it's ahead of its time. What William Castle really was, and you know, people didn't appreciate him at the time. I do think we're going to come back to this era, and I think there was certain films around this era that I think we haven't discussed.
Yes.
Both good, you know, like say the sort of the more thoughtful, or you know, presented, you know, probably closest to like Forbidden Planet, and then also there's Ed Wood films that we haven't touched on either. So,
I love Ed Wood.
Yeah. So, you know, there's Plan 9 and a couple of others. So we need, I think that's sort of, there's a gap there. We will definitely have to return to at some point.
Yes, for sure.
But yeah, that's our 50s block. We've done it. We've gone through the 50s, a decade special, a decade specification. But we're not done. We're not done with the season by a long shot. This is just an aperitif, an appetizer, if you will, to get you to whet your appetite for what else we've got coming. Because in the next episode, we've got your first choice, Julian. We're going to be going into the 60s. I don't know what year it is.
1960 and into France.
Yeah, with Eyes Without a Face. And I know very little about this film. I know of it, but I don't know much about it. So, yeah, and then we just launch from there. Just to run through them. So we've got Eyes Without a Face in the next episode.
Then this is The Man Who Fell to Earth. That was one of yours from 76.
Yeah, so we've got some David Bowie. And then we've got Star Trek, the motion picture. We've got like Buckaroo Banzai. Other things, we've got Little Shop of Horrors, Strange Days, Event Horizon, Gattaca.
You left out Demolition Man.
Demolition Man.
Strange Days. The masterpiece.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
I know you are. You smile every time you talk about it.
Oh, it's amazing. I can't believe in this one season I've got I've managed to squeeze in a Vincent Price film and Demolition and a Stallone film. I think it's I deserve some sort of award for that.
It's a shame they didn't get to collaborate, you know.
Yeah. I'm not even sure how that would have looked. And let's see, we've got Event Horizon, we've got Gattaca, Open Your Eyes, Vanilla Sky, and The Fountain. And I'm really excited for some of those.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah. Two films on that, Gattaca was a film I watched a lot in the early 2000s. On DVD, and I probably haven't watched it since like 2005. It's probably been like 15 years since I've seen that film. So I'm really looking forward to going back to that, because that is a good film. But I'm also really interested to see the two things. I know I keep smiling at Demolition Man because I know it's possibly one of the dumbest films ever made. But it has some really interesting things to say about it. Sort of weirdly satirizes action films.
I will say, all I'll say is I have, you know, there are several movies on here that I have not seen before. I know I have seen Demolition Man all the way through. I know when I watch it, I will remember watching it. I cannot for the life of me, I could not picture any scene from this movie. I could not tell you. I know I've seen it. I cannot remember anything.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's the fact that this film has got like demonstrated. Yeah, it's got Wesley Snipes with blonde hair. Jesse the Body Ventura's in it.
Yeah, I do dimly remember this. I mean, there's like
Yeah.
they fight in the climax in some kind of like circular room where they're sort
Yeah.
of like shooting at it. Yeah, I've seen this. I
The
don't
guy who
remember.
played, I forget his name now, and it's really bothering me. The guy who played Humphrey Appleby in Yes Minister is the baddie in it. It's amazing.
There's
It's
a lot
amazing.
of one-liner, like action one-liners that don't quite land. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, that's most of early '90s sort of action cinema. The biggie for me though, sort of like I think what's of the what we've got coming up. What's the one film, from your sort of selections? What is your one film that you're like, oh yeah, I really can't wait to get my teeth into that?
Well, two that I have not seen. I haven't seen Eyes Without a Face, even though it was my selection. I've never seen it, and it's always on the short list of sort of like greatest French and foreign sci-fi ever made. I should have seen this long ago. But also, I've never seen Buckaroo Banzai, to my knowledge. I'm pretty sure I'd remember that one, unlike Demolition Man.
Yeah, that's one. That's another one that makes me chuckle because I'm half expecting like an email or something after you've watched it, like what is this?
Well, I made you watch Valerian, so
that's true. This is my counter to Valerian in that respect.
what are you looking
For me,
forward to?
I'm really looking forward to Buckaroo Banzai. I really am. The other one, weirdly, is The Fountain. Because I remember when it was released and I read a lot about it, and it was one of those films I was really like, I really want to go see that. That sounds really cool. I love the concept, and just never got around to seeing it. It just sort of passed me by. And so it's sort of one of those that sort of has popped up on like Netflix or Prime or something like that, and I really want to watch that, but I want to give it my full attention, and I've never had an excuse to do that. So now that I've got that chance, I'm really looking forward to talking about that film. So
yeah, it is definitely. I mean, I love The Fountain a lot, and I come back to it in my head a lot. I won't spoil anything, but I think that is correct that you really have to pay attention, and it can be clunky in parts, but it's kind of a experience where you sort of have to. You don't have to let your logical mind go, but it is just an experience of a movie where, it's mind-boggling and interesting and moving. And what more can I say? That's what I want.
I'm really looking forward to it. It's having an excuse to be able to say, no, switch everything else off, and I'm just going to watch this film. So it's going to be ace. So yeah, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. We've got an excellent season coming. We've got some doozies coming up. But I
can't wait till season 4. No, we'll have to, select even more. Do you know that that the Tingler was since it was the 50s decade that we were discussing, the Tingler was our 50th episode. And this is our 51st episode right now, counting the interstitials.
The bonus episodes and stuff.
Yes, like the all the Red Dwarf stuff.
I was going to say Red Dwarf really boosted us. Then it was almost like an entire season in and of itself, really.
Yeah, that was 13 episodes.
Yeah, wow. So 51 episodes we've done of discussing some of the best and not so best sci-fi of the 20th century. But yeah, so that's something to celebrate. We're halfway to 100 episodes. There you go. That's a real achievement. And so, if you're listening along, and to those people that I also know watch along, thank you very much for sticking with us. And I'm hoping that this has been you've enjoyed this and you've been able to enjoy the discussion. You've had a week off or at least 2 weeks off of having to watch a film, so you can join in the discussion. And if you do want to engage with us, you want to come find us, please find us on Twitter. That's at PodTimespace. Or we do work under the 20th Century Geek media banner, which is the sister podcast, which is what I do. So, if you want to email us, you can at 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com. And we will happily sort of answer emails. And you can find out all kinds of bits and pieces, but also the 20th Century Geek Media as a banner for both podcasts and all sort of little projects I'm sure will crop up later on down the line, have got a Patreon. That's right. We want to keep this ad-free and we want to keep the lights on at 20th Century Towers. So if you want to go support us, we have a Patreon. That's patreon.com/20CG Media. So you can go find that. It's in the notes below. That's going to be sort of there now. And on that podcast, on Patreon, you get a monthly podcast of me giving my 30-minute thoughts. You get a quarterly podcast of us talking to creators, all kinds of different people. I just had a fantastic conversation with a guy called Jason Impey, who is a director, independent film director. And also Julian and I do a weekly podcast. We are not only, we did Red Dwarf, we did Westworld, and now we are doing an episode by episode discussion of The Twilight Zone, starting from the original 1959 series, starting from episode 1 and working our way through. Week by week, you will get short bursts. Episodes are about 15 to 20 minutes long, and we are talking about every episode of The Twilight Zone. And it's been absolutely stunning so far. As of the recording of this, I think only the first one's been released. So by the time it's actually out, you'll have at least 4 or 5 episodes to jump on there and try out, all at the lowest level. Those podcasts, the weekly podcast is at the lowest possible level. So you can go in there and pay, I forget what it is now, $5 or whatever, and you get so much content because you're going to get over a year's worth of back catalogue. So go check that out.
Yeah, and I really like that because I want people to, support, and I think, most people can afford that, lower level. And, when you become a patron on Patreon, do you have access to all those past links?
Yep, they're all there. Yeah, everything. So the moment you set in,
you get the whole library.
Oh yeah, you get a massive back catalogue of stuff. You get an RSS feed. You get a link that you just set up. It's really easy, and then that's it. On whatever device you are on, you will have a full back catalogue of every podcast that's on there. In addition to that, there's been posts that I've put on there about behind the scenes things. So I've been working with Julian as my sort of publisher for Sequat, doing a Judge Dredd book. And there's behind the scenes comments and notes about things on there. So you get all kinds of bits and pieces, and there will be more stuff in the future. So it's an absolute treasure trove of, as we refer to in the intro. I'm really fond of the intro I've done for the for the Twilight Zone things. An abundance of waffle and substance is how I like to refer to it now. So go check that out. The links are below. The final thing, if you do like what we're doing on this podcast, go onto your podcast catcher, just go through and leave a review. Any stars, don't have to write anything, just leave a review or a star rating. It helps us get up the charts, makes people aware of us, and we can then become the sci-fi review podcast, as we say that we are.
Yeah, we really appreciate it because, this is great fun, Scott, and I always learn talking from you. And I have such a great time. I mean, if nothing else, this forces me to watch those movies. Yeah. And then I get to see you and we catch up and we hash stuff out. And I always get to see from another perspective and I learn from you. But it is a lot of work. I mean, you're putting the podcasts up. We're watching them. We've got lives. We're talking about them. There is work involved here. And if you enjoy it, bless your heart. We really appreciate it. But reviewing it, anything you can to, to help us reach that audience or to help keep the light on at the 20th Century Tower, that single light illuminating those towers.
It's just one cord with a bulb. That's it.
That's true. But, electricity, it's expensive. C'est très cher in Britain.
Yes.
So we really appreciate it. I mean, tell your friends, tell your lovers, tell your enemies, force them to watch Valerian.
Yeah, that's it. They can help us get through some of these films. Some they'll love, some maybe not. But, again, like you said, we've done 51 episodes. Even the free stuff, that you're getting 51 episodes of us talking about this stuff. And I am proud of every episode we've done.
Me too. What you're not saying is 51 episodes. That's like what, like 250 hours or something.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I'm joking because we go on, but
We do, yeah. If we recorded everything, everything out, it probably would be. But yeah. Probably the only one that's not top tier is my rant about Westworld season 3. But even that is entertaining. I'm guarantee you'll at least get some chuckles out of that.
Well, I was going to joke that, I mean, I liked some of these movies this season, but they're no Westworld season 3. I mean, nothing can compare to the majesty. And I'm getting production updates about season 4 on my phone.
Yeah. We'll see whether we return to that series. We really will. Oh well. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for sticking with us. Thank you very much for listening in. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we shall see you or at least talk to you on the next episode for Eyes Without a Face.